On July 14, 2025, the U.S. government abruptly ended the 2019 tomato suspension agreement and slapped a 17% tariff on every fresh tomato crossing from Mexico. No warning, no transition plan, just a policy stroke that instantly reshaped a $3 billion market. Within weeks, retail tomato prices in places like Raleigh, North Carolina, spiked over 40%, with some organic varieties soaring 60%. Grocery shoppers paused, frowned, and walked away from the produce aisle. Meanwhile, Mexico, controlling 70% of the U.S. fresh tomato supply, quietly pivoted north, sealing multi-million-dollar deals with Canada. Was this protectionism's bold victory, or the moment America handed its neighbor a golden ticket? For decades, the U.S.-Mexico tomato trade was one of the most stable agricultural relationships in North America. Since the late 1990s, a series of agreements, most notably the 2019 Tomato Suspension Agreement, kept prices predictable, supply steady, and tensions low. Mexico's year-round growing climate meant that American consumers could enjoy ripe tomatoes in the depths of winter, while U.S. supermarkets and restaurant chains relied on predictable imports to keep menus and shelves stocked. In turn, Mexico's farmers enjoyed a guaranteed high-volume market just across the border, with over two-thirds of their exports heading north. The system worked. It was efficient, profitable, and, above all, mutually beneficial. But beneath the surface, tensions brewed. U.S. growers, particularly in Florida, argued that Mexico was dumping tomatoes at prices American farmers couldn't match. They claimed subsidies and lower labor costs in Mexico undercut domestic producers, eroding local market share. Periodic disputes flared, each time threatening to dismantle the delicate balance. By the early 2000s and 20s, these grievances intensified. Rising nationalism in U.S. trade policy, coupled with pandemic-era supply chain shocks, gave protectionist voices more leverage. The shift became visible when the U.S. Commerce Department signaled in mid-2024 that it was reviewing the terms of the tomato deal. Behind closed doors, Florida growers lobbied hard for higher duties, framing the issue as one of fairness and food security. Meanwhile, Mexican exporters warned that any tariff would push them to diversify away from the U.S. market. By summer 2025, the stage was set. Long-standing commercial trust was now weighed against political expediency. When the tariff hit on July 14th, it didn't just disrupt a supply chain, it fractured a 30-year trade relationship, and with it, the assumption that agricultural trade in North America was immune to the swings of political strategy. When the United States announced on July 14, 2025, that it was terminating the 2019 Tomato Suspension Agreement and imposing a 17% tariff on fresh tomato imports from Mexico, it was a move both sudden and symbolically charged. The Department of Commerce justified the decision as a necessary safeguard against what it called predatory pricing practices and market distortions caused by Mexico's dominance in the sector. Florida tomato growers, organized through the Florida Tomato Exchange, had been pushing for such measures for years, arguing that their livelihoods were under siege. In their view, the Mexican advantage was twofold: lower labor costs and a year-round climate that allowed for continuous production. U.S. farms, especially in Florida, faced seasonal limits, higher wages, and stricter environmental regulations, factors that made competing on price nearly impossible. By framing the tariff as a defense of domestic jobs and fair trade, the administration tapped into the same protectionist sentiment that had defined earlier trade disputes over steel, aluminum, and lumber. Yet the manner of the rollout raised eyebrows. There was no phase-in period, no gradual escalation. One day, Mexican exporters were operating under the agreed rules of the Suspension Pact. The next, every truckload crossing the border faced a 17% surcharge. Importers were caught off guard, their supply contracts suddenly out of balance. Major distributors warned of immediate price spikes, and that warning became reality within weeks. In cities like Raleigh, North Carolina, and Austin, Texas, retail tomato prices surged 30 to 45%, with premium organic varieties climbing as much as 60%. From the White House podium, officials painted the move as a long overdue reset. American farmers deserve a level playing field, the Commerce Secretary declared. But critics saw something else, a political maneuver aimed at securing votes in swing states like Florida, where agricultural lobbies wield significant influence. Representative Henry Cuellar of Texas blasted the decision, warning that it would kill jobs faster than it saves them in border communities dependent on cross-border agricultural trade. Cuellar's office cited data projecting losses of up to 46,000 U.S. jobs and $8.3 billion in economic activity in Texas alone. The U.S. bet was clear. Short-term supply shocks and higher prices would be acceptable collateral damage if it meant reviving domestic tomato farming. But that bet underestimated the speed and the strategic agility of Mexico's response. In a globalized food economy, cutting off one market rarely means cutting off opportunity, and Mexico was about to prove it. Within days of the U.S. announcement, Mexican exporters began accelerating a contingency plan that had been quietly in development for months. The core of the strategy: bypass the U.S. entirely and reorient exports toward Canada, a market with high demand for fresh produce and no appetite for sudden tariff shocks. Central to this pivot was infrastructure. Using investments from both public and private sources, Mexico fast-tracked the completion of a refrigerated rail corridor, an unbroken cold chain running from production hubs in western Mexico through the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, connecting to Canadian Pacific Kansas City rail lines heading straight to Ontario and Quebec. By eliminating the U.S. as a transit point, Mexico avoided American inspection delays and fees, while ensuring Canadian buyers received produce just as fresh as if it had been trucked directly across a short border. The results were immediate. Canadian supermarket giants like Loblaws and Metro signed 5-year contracts for not only tomatoes, but also bell peppers and strawberries from Mexico's agriculturally rich Sinaloa and Baja California regions. FreightWaves reported that by 2026, nearly half, 48%, of Mexico's fresh tomato exports would be headed to Canada, a stunning leap from less than 1% just 2 years earlier. For Canada, the deal was more than just a supply agreement. It was a statement. Canadian importers began shifting capital away from U.S. border hubs like McAllen, Texas, into new cold storage facilities in Toronto and Montreal. One Windsor, Ontario facility that opened in late 2025 was booked solid through the first quarter of 2026 before its ribbon-cutting ceremony had even ended. The political undertone was unmistakable. By offering stability in pricing and contract terms, Canada positioned itself as a reliable trade partner in contrast to America's unpredictable, election cycle-driven policy swings. The contrast resonated with Mexican exporters burned by what they saw as Washington's disregard for long-standing agreements. This northward reorientation didn't come without challenges. Logistics costs had to be recalculated and Canadian regulatory requirements met. But the speed with which it happened underscored one thing: Mexico was not beholden to the U.S. market in the way Washington policymakers had assumed. And as the Canadian market opened its arms, the American market felt the first pangs of being left behind. By early autumn 2025, both sides were entrenched. In the U.S., the administration held firm on the tariff, doubling down on its rhetoric of economic nationalism. Florida growers hailed the move as a partial victory, though it remained unclear whether domestic production could fill the gap left by declining Mexican imports. Prices for U.S.-grown tomatoes remained high, and restaurant groups warned of menu changes and reduced profitability. Mexico, for its part, had little incentive to return to the negotiating table. The Canadian contracts provided a stable revenue stream, offsetting much of the lost U.S. business. Export volumes to America dipped sharply. but the blow was cushioned by higher per-unit prices in Canada and reduced dependency on a single, politically volatile market. The standoff created a strange symmetry. Both countries claimed to be protecting their own, yet both bore economic costs. Job losses in U.S. border towns, revenue dips for Mexican exporters still tied to the American market, and rising prices for consumers on both sides. Canada, meanwhile, sat in the middle, quietly consolidating its role as the unexpected winner in a dispute it hadn't started. What emerged was not a trade war in the traditional sense, but a frozen conflict. The U.S. had drawn a line in the sand, Mexico had walked around it, and Canada had rolled out the welcome mat. The question was no longer who would back down, it was how long all three could afford to hold their ground. At first glance, Canada appeared to be the clear beneficiary of Washington's tariff gambit. Supermarket chains got guaranteed contracts, Mexican suppliers got a stable buyer, and consumers enjoyed a fresh supply of produce without the volatility now plaguing U.S. markets. But beneath the headlines, the ripple effects were more complicated. Take the case of Windsor, Ontario. In late 2025, the city celebrated the grand opening of a state-of-the-art cold storage facility designed specifically for imported Mexican produce. The warehouse, equipped with advanced humidity and temperature controls, became a symbol of Canada's growing role in North America's produce supply chain. But the very success of the facility created new pressures. Demand for skilled logistics, labor soared, wages spiked, and smaller local produce distributors struggled to compete for staff. Moreover, the flood of Mexican imports began to put quiet strain on Canadian greenhouse growers. While Canada's domestic tomato industry is smaller than Mexico's, it is still significant, particularly in Ontario and British Columbia, where greenhouse operations supply major grocers. These growers suddenly face the challenge of competing against high-volume, lower-cost Mexican produce arriving directly at Canadian ports and rail hubs. Some warned of being priced out of their own local markets. For consumers, the initial benefit of stable prices risked being offset by broader agricultural shifts. If Canadian greenhouse production declined due to Mexican competition, the country could become more dependent on imports in the long term, leaving it vulnerable to its own set of geopolitical risks. In other words, while Canada gained in the short term by filling the gap left by U.S.-Mexico tensions, the structural changes in its produce market came with vulnerabilities that no amount of refrigeration technology could fully insulate against. For the United States, the economic blowback was both immediate and visible. In McAllen, Texas, once a thriving hub for cross-border produce, warehouses sat partially empty by September 2025. One distributor, which had specialized in importing Mexican tomatoes for decades, was forced to lay off 74 employees in a single month after losing key supplier relationships to Canadian buyers. The ripple effects extended beyond the warehouse floor. Trucking companies lost routes, packaging suppliers saw orders drop, and restaurants in border states faced higher wholesale prices. For consumers, the impact was painfully clear every time they visited the grocery store. In cities like Raleigh, North Carolina, and Denver, Colorado, the price for a pound of vine-ripened tomatoes jumped from $1.80 to over $2.50 within weeks of the tariff taking effect. Organic and specialty varieties, already premium priced, became a luxury purchase, with some farmers' market stalls charging over $4 per pound. Restaurant groups, particularly in the fast casual sector, scrambled to adjust menus. Chains that relied on fresh tomatoes for salads, salsas, and sandwiches either raised prices or reduced portion sizes. Some even shifted to canned or frozen alternatives, sacrificing quality to maintain margins. Ironically, the very domestic growers the tariff was designed to protect saw mixed results. While prices for U.S.-grown tomatoes rose, production costs also climbed, partly due to increased demand for labor and rising input prices. Farms in Florida and California struggled to ramp up production quickly enough to replace lost imports, and climate variability in 2025, marked by unusually heavy rains in Florida, further constrained supply. The political fallout was equally complex. While the tariff was popular among protectionist constituencies, its impact on everyday grocery bills became a talking point for critics of the administration's trade policy. By autumn, bipartisan voices in Congress were calling for a renegotiation of the tomato trade framework, not necessarily to revert to the old suspension agreement, but to find a middle ground that could stabilize prices without gutting domestic producers or alienating key trade partners. The U.S. had set out to shield its farmers from unfair competition. Instead, it found itself grappling with an uncomfortable reality. In a deeply interconnected North American supply chain, economic self-protection often comes with a steep bill, and in this case, that bill was landing squarely in American shopping carts. By the close of 2025, North America's tomato trade told a bigger story than just produce. The United States had doubled down on protectionism, betting it could rebuild domestic capacity by cutting off Mexican supply. Mexico had proven it could pivot rapidly, building a direct economic bridge to Canada. And Canada, whether by design or by chance, emerged as a central player in a supply chain it had once only skirted. But the arrangement is fragile. The same forces that upended U.S.-Mexico trade could one day test Canada's newfound advantage. In a world where food security, climate, and politics are inseparable, how long can any country rely on stable trade? What happens next will shape not just grocery bills, but the very map of North American commerce. Like this video, comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.